Hi, everyone. So I'm a PhD student at Stanford, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about our model for how to design an optimal draft lottery. And this is joint work with another PhD student at Stanford, Martino. So just for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to narrow our focus to the NBA because the problem of tanking is considered kind of the most intractable in the NBA, but a lot of the ideas in the paper are applicable to all four major sports leagues. So just a little bit of history of the NBA lottery. They've changed the system a lot so that the lottery odds for the worst team have ranged from as high as 50% pre-1985. From 1985 to 1990, they had a uniform lottery where there was actually no favoring the worst team in the league. The lottery odds were equal for non-playoff teams. And then the last 20 or 30 years, the odds for the worst ranked team in the league have changed from 17%, 25%, 14%. So the league's trying to solve for something. And we're going to try to dig in a little bit and figure out what they're trying to solve for. So the first part of our paper is trying to write down explicitly what the league objective is and to simplify, all the different league objectives that they have to something that focuses on exactly what they're trying to design the draft allocation policy for. So we're going to assume that the league would like to maximize the probability that the lowest ranked team receives the highest draft pick. But they're constrained in doing that they also want to eliminate incentives to tank, which, as most of you know, which is where a team intentionally starts losing at some point in the season in order to increase their draft pick odds. Now the question is, how well is this objective being met right now? So currently, as I showed here, the probability for the worst team is only 14%. So I'd argue that the first objective is not being met all that well. We're not really favoring the worst teams in the league that much on the current system. And the second is that there's still a ton of discussion about tanking, even under the current system. If you look at sports blogs or in the sports media, there's constant discussion about who should be tanking, who is tanking. So I'd argue right now we're not meeting our objectives very well, and there is even a question about whether or not it's possible to satisfy both objectives. So I think this is a great quote from Greg Wyshynski in the context of the NHL, and he says if you don't want tanking, then essentially you don't want the welfare mechanism that encourages it. So if you're anti-tank, you might as well be pro-draft abolishment. And so part of our paper is going to be looking at this statement and figuring out under what conditions this is true and under what conditions this is actually not true, and we can do better than what Greg is suggesting. So this isn't the first paper on proposing alternative draft rules. There is existing work which actually shows that tanking is a real thing, so that if teams do have an incentive to lose, they do lose more often than teams in the exact same scenario who don't have the same incentives to lose. And there's been alternative, so Adam Gold, who I think presented here in another year, has a tombstone rule, and Lenton, Smith, and Boyce have another alternative rule. Now, what's new about our paper is that we're writing down a mathematical model for what the team's objectives are, what the league's objectives are, and we use the tools of game theory and mechanism design to prove what's possible in this simplified model, and actually show what's optimal in this simplified model. So it's a framework that can be used to analyze other alternative draft rules, the current draft rule, and we also use the framework to come up with our own draft rule. So our research question is it possible to design a lottery that favors the worst team, but eliminates all incentives for tanking? And the first answer is an impossibility result. And that says that under the current system, it's impossible to do this, to favor the worst team in the league, if the lottery is based on the final rankings only, which is how the current system is set up. You're just basing your lottery on the final rankings. Now, our second answer, which is more positive, says that if we think about designing the lottery in a different way, if we make it dependent on when wins and losses occur rather than just the cumulative wins and losses, then it is possible to design a lottery that favors the worst team but also eliminates the incentives for tanking. Okay, so there's a lot of math in the paper, but I only have 15 minutes, so I'm not going to bore any of you guys with the details. And if you're interested, the paper has the actual model set up rigorously, and the proof's done more rigorously. And we'll just go through the intuition for today. So in our simplified model of team decision making, we're imagining that teams are just competing for two prizes. One of those prizes is making the playoffs, and that goes to the top-ranked 16 teams, the NBA. And the other prize is getting the first-round draft pick. So we're simplifying from the full draft to just thinking about the first draft pick. This can be extended to multiple draft picks. To keep things simple, we'll just think about the first draft pick. And we assume that the team makes a single decision, which is whether or not to exert effort in the game. And they the condition that we derive from this model of team decision making is that the benefit from winning a game, which is if I win, I increase my probability of making the playoffs, I decrease my probability of receiving the draft pick. If I lose, increase the probability of receiving the draft pick, decrease the probability of making the playoffs. Now, my benefit from winning a game should always be greater than or equal to the benefit from losing a game. And that's the condition that must hold for all games and for all teams under some draft rule for us to not have tanking, given that draft rule. And we can very quickly see that under the current system, once we just think about benefit of winning versus benefit of losing in any game, tanking is unavoidable. So for any lottery, I mean, the league could continue to experiment with any kind of lottery based on the final records, and as long as that lottery is fixed in advance and favors the team with the worst records, after a team's eliminated from playoffs, their probability of making the playoffs is now 0, of course. And so under our simplified model, if they just care about making the playoffs versus receiving the draft pick, at this point, losing has more of a benefit than winning, which, again, that probably makes sense to everyone. And so in games that affect their final ranking, they should always attempt to lose up to the point of avoiding penalties from the NBA, which does penalize this sort of behavior. So they should tank in all games post-elimination, and that's why you see a lot, a spike in discussion of tanking kind of in the March, April part of the year. Once teams have a low enough probability of making the playoffs, their benefits from losing start under the current system become better than their benefits from winning. So that's the fundamental problem. And it's what's interesting is that problem can actually be solved by thinking about the season as a sequence of events rather than something that happens all at once with a ranking that occurs at the end of the season. And so our policy targets the league objective directly by, after each game, you re-estimate the probability that each team will be ranked last after the season concludes, conditional on the games that have happened so far. So you can imagine if we just assume teams have equal ability, which we don't have to, but let's assume they do, at the beginning of the season before any games have occurred, then we just model that every team has an equal probability of coming last in the season, and everyone has an equal probability of receiving the draft pick at that point. Now, as games come in, let's imagine I go on a 10-game losing streak. Meanwhile, other teams are accumulating wins and losses and improving their record compared to my record. Now, after my 10-game losing streak, conditional on the games that have happened so far, my probability of ending up ranked last in the season goes up, and so my draft probability goes up under this system. If we continue to do this all through the season, then the team that ended up last would receive the draft pick with probability 1. But we don't do that because that would encourage tanking at some point in the season based on how the process that I described earlier. So what we do is that we stop the process when, if it continued, teams would have some incentive to lose. So you can imagine the lottery probabilities adapt over time, and they freeze at some point in the season. And the stopping time in the season is dependent on what happens in that season. And now the benefit of this, because we're targeting the probabilities based on the actual probability of every team becoming last, in expectation, we prove that you give the draft pick to the lowest ranked team with the highest probability. And we also remove incentives within a season to tank. So one important caveat is this model is targeting tanking as defined as a team choosing at some point in the season to start losing, as opposed to a rebuilding strategy where over multiple seasons, teams strip down their talent and look to accumulate draft picks. And we can talk about some ways we might want to think about modifying this for a rebuilding strategy, but as written, the paper is targeting a tanking strategy which is in the middle of a season and not throughout the whole season. Okay, so I'm going to show some examples of how the rule works on previous data using data from the NBA. So we're going to simulate how the rule would have set the probabilities in a few seasons. And we're going to start with 1980s data. And the reason we're starting with 1980s data is because at that time, the NBA lottery was uniform and also discouraged tanking. So the estimate of our rule is unbiased on this data set because the behavior of teams at that time, at least according to our model, wasn't being tainted by the tanking that was encouraged by later rules. But we'll also show the results of the rule on some more recent data as well. So in 1999, the Miami Heat didn't do very well in the season. And so they end up actually receiving under our rule the first draft pick with a probability of 44%, which is much higher than any of the kind of recent NBA lotteries. And also comes with our guarantee that tanking wasn't encouraged. And we can look and see exactly how the probabilities were adapted over time and how we got to this point and why it's conceivable that there wasn't kind of the same kind of tanking incentives in this setup than there is in the current setup. So at the beginning of the season, the Heat went on, a 200-plus game losing streak. That's not 200-plus games is all games that were played in the season at that point. So the Heat obviously didn't play 200 games. So they go on this long losing streak. And at the beginning of the season, what's interesting to note is that even though they're on this big losing streak, the blue line, which is the probability that they end up last in the season, doesn't increase all that much at first. Because what's valuable about uncertainty in a sports context, in this context, is that there's a ton of uncertainty at the beginning of the season about what's going to happen because there's a ton of games left to be played. And so the incentive to lose isn't very strong at the beginning of the season because even if you're not a great team, by some chance you may end up in the playoffs, and even after losing a few games, there's still a good chance that you can kind of overcome that deficit. So we take advantage of the fact that the incentives to lose are much weaker at the beginning of the season. We adjust the probabilities at that point. Now, at some point, the Heat have lost enough games that it's very unlikely that they're going to make the playoffs. And their incentives to lose start to increase, their incentives to win start to decrease. And at the inflection point where those incentives to lose cross the incentives to win, then we freeze the draft probabilities going forward. So we've taken advantage of the fact that at the beginning of the season, incentives to lose within that season are very weak. We adjust all the way to 44% because that's the probability that the Heat come last after only a third of the game in the season. And then we freeze the probabilities going forward. And from then on, there's no incentive issues because you can't change your draft probability because it's fixed after 330 games. Someone tell me who this is. That's right. So this guy was really valuable, and everyone was very excited when he came up for the draft. And there was a lot of talk of that the Knicks cheated in order to get him that year by freezing the lottery ball so that they would know which one to pick. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But we're going to assume then we're going to push our rule and kind of break it as much as possible and show what's kind of the worst case scenario where the incentives to lose are really strong in a season. And this kind of helps show what are the forces at play that determine tanking and how our rule also adapts in order to take that into account. So now rather, in most of the paper, we're just assuming that the value of making the playoffs is a multiple of receiving the first draft pick. But in this case, we're going to assume they're approximately equal. And in that case, the incentives to lose are very strong. And so we only are able to take into account the first few games that every team plays. And we're very close to the NBA lottery in the end, which was like a uniform lottery. But we still target the Indiana Pacers with a slightly higher draft probability than uniform, which is a 19% probability. So this is kind of the scenario where the rule's stressed because the incentives to lose are so high, we can't take too much information into account because if we take that information into account, then we're going to end up in a scenario where we encourage tanking after the first 100 games in the season. And lastly, I just wanted to show you some data from 2019. So this is more recent data. The Phoenix Suns had the most losses kind of towards the beginning of the season. We take the first 376 games into account, and they have the highest draft probability. But I think what's nice is you can see here that the teams that lost at the beginning of the season were a good predictor of the teams that ended up last at the end of the season. And so that the meat of the probability is between the Atlanta Hawks and the New York Knicks, and we don't give very much probability to the other 7 non-playoff teams that are, have a much better record than the bottom non-playoff teams. Whereas in the NBA lottery currently, in an effort to discourage tanking, they've spread the probabilities much more widely out among those bottom teams, and they actually give to the other 7 non-playoff teams an 18.5% probability, which is quite high. That's a 1 in 5 chance that one of those teams, which are in a much better class, I would argue, than the bottom 7, the bottom 7 teams, an 18.5% probability. So what do I want you guys to take away from this? This is the first paper to try to write down a model for why tanking occurs, and under that model to figure out what are the incentives to lose and how to deal with those incentives. So the key insight is that the incentives change depending on the season. So fixing a lottery that's dependent on the end of the season can never work if you want to favor worse teams and you want to completely avoid tanking. And so in general, you should take earlier games into account much more than later games in the season if you're trying to predict who's the worst team in the league without providing incentives to tank. And we simulate the rule in action. We find that it nearly always favors the worst team without providing incentives to tank, and we adapt depending on both season-specific results and potentially the draft value if we would like to. And that leaves 10 minutes for questions from the judges.
Okay, that was terrific. I have a bunch of questions. You guys should just jump in if you want to take the mic from me. Okay, first a quick clarification question. So you assume a uniform prior. Is there any reason why you wouldn't use information from the previous season?
So the problem with using information from the previous season is then you could give incentives at the end of the previous season for teams to lose and cause you to update their prior for the next season. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would become a much more complicated problem because you'd have to think about the incentives over time. And so the way we think about the uniform prior is it's approximating the right thing to do. And you're right that if you just knew teams' ability, if you could just see exactly how good they were, well, then maybe you should just give the draft pick to the worst team. Right. And so we don't know that, and we have to use the results from the season to approximate that.
Okay, nice. And then I'm not sure if I quite understood this. So when you pick the stopping point, each of the individual teams may have a different point in the season at which that crossover happens. So you pick the stopping point as an average over all the teams, or how do you make that determination?
So we pick the stopping point based on the first team.
Oh, the first?
The first team that might violate that rule, then we stop before they violate it.
Okay.
And that requires forecasting the ranks of the teams at the end of the season. So the information that goes into that, determining if someone might tank or not, is a forecast of what's going to happen in the season.
I see. Okay. And when the stopping point happens, do you tell the teams that now we've stopped, or do they not know when the stopping point happens?
There would be no need to tell them that. I don't think the informational
it doesn't make
issue
a difference.
is a problem in our model. You could tell them that you're stopping.
I see. I mean, I could tell. I agree that it wouldn't make a difference for the one that is triggering it, but for the others, if they are that gives them then they're factoring something in just besides their own personal crossover point, right?
So I think that the basic premise. The basic premise is that you're taking information into account and then you're stopping taking information into account. And I don't think telling people that I'm no longer taking information into account should impact their behavior before you stop taking information into account. Yeah. I don't think that would be it.
Okay. I'm going to ask one more and then let you guys. So the other, I really liked at the beginning where you had the chart showing how the draft changed over time, which means that you actually have a bunch of randomized control experiments about how the structure of the draft impacts things like parity in the league. Have you taken a look at that, or do you know if other people have taken a look at that?
So that first paper I cited on the literature review slide used exactly that. So they looked at the season before when it was a uniform lottery and there weren't bad incentives, and they looked at the seasons afterwards, and they tried to find scenarios where teams were in the same position with two different policies, and there's you can actually see a strong effect on losing probability.
Nice.
So they have done that.
Okay, that's great.
Great talk. So my question is really about this stopping time and if there's ways that teams would game this system. So as an example, if I'm running a team, what would stop me? So in the Ewing example, that stopping time was 97 games, which is about 6.5, 7 games per team.
Yep.
What would stop me from just deliberately losing my first 7 games, hitting the stopping time, getting the number 1 pick, and then,
So in our model, if we're assuming that we're getting the forecast right, then we're explicitly modeling that the increase that they're going to get in those first 7 games is not worth it to them based on the decrease in probability that they're getting of the playoffs, even in 7 games. And that's why the probabilities are barely adjusted from the uniform point when we stop at 100 games. So you're right that if in 6 games we adjusted all the way to 100%, then people would do that. But we're modeling that what we're doing is small enough that people, whatever they're giving up is more than whatever they're getting from the draft.
But it is technically possible that you would have a team both get the number 1 pick and win the championship.
So there's a question about what to do with the small amount of probability that's left over with teams that actually do make the playoffs. And so one thing you can do is redistribute all that probability uniformly to the teams that don't make the playoffs. So you
take the teams that actually make the playoffs and you exclude them anyway.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense.
Thanks. My question is sort of an extension of Luke's question, which is that, so say you're successful and you kill tanking and there aren't 2 or 3 obvious tanking teams anymore. So now you're setting your date far later into the season, and you'd imagine there'd be more parity in the bottom of the league. How would you account for something catastrophic, like a rash of injuries or some act of God that would take a team that was, looking at the 8th or 7th seed and now is completely out of contention?
So right now, we're using a really simple model for forecasting what happens wins in the league. I think something like that, which is something completely unexpected, wouldn't be taken into account. But something that you could have some forecast, like let's say an injured player was coming back into the season, you should be taking into account that known information in your forecast of who ends up ranked last in the season. So the point of like someone ending up, 5 games left in the season, their key players all get injured, you couldn't give them a draft pick because that information is just not taken into account. So it's taking information up until a certain point. Information that comes after, unfortunately, you can't take it into account.
So, and then the reverse would also then be true, right? So then there would be an incentive to sign someone like DeMarcus Cousins, who's coming back from an Achilles injury late in the season, who would provide a boost after the draft had been set. That theoretically could happen as well.
Yes, that theoretically could happen as well. Let's say you get a good draft pick, you want to win some more games in the season, but again, you'd still end up underneath the playoffs. So it'd just be the marginal benefit of finishing, 13th in the league instead of 14th, instead of 16th in the league or something like that.
Great, thanks.
Do we have time for me to ask one more?
Yes, there's still time.
Okay, so, great. So at the very beginning, you said that there was a proof that if you only base it on the final standings, then there's always this conflict of incentives. Is that a mathematical proof? And if so, can you just give me like the 2 or 3 sentence version of what's in the proof?
Yes. So the way that you do it is you want to prove, and sorry for the people that don't like the terminology, or don't know the terminology, you prove that there's always some history of the season such that there will be a violation of the incentives. And that history of the season, you just pick one where teams are tied at the ranking where the probability favors some worse team, some arbitrarily worse team. And you choose that, you show that at that history when they're tied, it's the last game in the season, then this team always has an incentive to lose. So we just pick a single history. We don't go into like how many histories out of all possible histories result in tanking, but you could.
So it's an existence. I just have to find one that works.
Yes.
Yeah, got it. Okay,
Yep.
Nice.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right, next up we have Lotte Bronson, who will talk about player chemistry and how to put together the perfect soccer team.
Are the slides? Great. Okay, yeah, my name is Lotte Bronson. I'm lead data scientist at SciSport, and I present joint work with my colleague Jan van Haren. And our paper is called Player Chemistry, Striving for a Perfectly Balanced Soccer Team. While thinking of a perfectly balanced soccer team, I always think about the current Liverpool team. They won the Champions League last season. Currently, they're leading in the Premier League with 25 points ahead of the number 2. And the great thing about this team is that they don't have one star. They have like everyone in the team has his role, and that makes them so strong. So the thing is, like, it's not a team with the best players, but the players who make the best team that win. And that's like one of the motivations for our work. So we've seen in the past that chemistry between players leads to successes. So for example, at Atlanta United, Almiron and Martinez were great together. They won the MLS 2 years ago, 2018, and they scored many goals together, assisted each other, leading to this success. As well as Messi and Suarez at Barcelona for many years, they've had successes. Also some defensive duos, like Chiellini and Bonucci at Juventus and at the Italian national team. And also the famous duo of Vidic and Ferdinand at Manchester United, who won a lot of leagues in the zeros. So seeing this, we know that chemistry leads to successes, but actually in soccer analytics, a lot of research is focused in the terms of recruitment on individual players. So in the scouting of individual players. But if you look at this example, in 2011, Liverpool bought 2 players, 2 strikers, Andy Carroll and Luis Suarez. And Andy Carroll was very unhappy at Liverpool. He didn't succeed there. Well, Suarez was great, and in the end also made a transfer to Barcelona. So what happened? Well, one of the reasons behind this is that Suarez dealt way better with his teammates than Carroll did. So Carroll is a tall striker. He needs crosses from the side to show his strength and to head the ball in. And he didn't get those crosses at Liverpool. While Suarez is like a player who strives when he gets good balls from midfielders like Gerrard. And that's why he was very successful there. So this brings me to 3 questions that soccer practitioners might ask themselves. So for example, performance coach, how do players impact each other's performances? So for example, how do Carroll and Gerrard play together, or Suarez and Gerrard? Same for a scout. So how would a given transfer target impact the performances of the players in the squad? So maybe we could have, with our framework, we could have helped Liverpool to tell them like, okay, maybe you should only buy Suarez and don't buy Carroll because we see that Suarez gels way better with the teammates. And the other way around, from a player's perspective. So being a player, you want to go to a team where you will succeed, where you have like the teammates who give you the passes, the crosses that you need. So for a player, you might ask like, which club should I go to in order to have like a optimal chemistry team? So we start with the first question. That's what we want to do. So we want to measure how do players impact each other's performances. And for this, we look at offensive chemistry and defensive chemistry. So with offensive chemistry, I mean, how do these player pairs, so how do they impact the chance of scoring for their team? Defensive chemistry is the other way around. How do they impact the chances of decreasing the team's chance of conceding a goal? And for this, we use our VAPE framework. So that's similar to EPV in other sports like basketball. That's used to value game states. So if you look at player chemistry, we have like on the left-hand side, we have the offensive chemistry. So how do they score goals together, or how do they create chances for their team to score goals? On the other hand, we have like the defensive chemistry. And I'll start to explain the offensive chemistry. How did we measure this? For this, we look at all interactions between player pairs. So in the next video, you see an interaction between Messi and Suarez. So Messi receives the ball on his own half. He passes it to Suarez, who then crosses it in the box. So what we do, we first look at the value of having the ball at the position that Messi received the ball. So the game state value was 0.005. It actually means that in 5 out of 1,000 similar situations, we've seen that such a possession leads to a goal. We do the same for the next game state. So Suarez receiving the ball from Messi, and then also the end of the game state, like the end of the cross by Suarez. And if we see this example, we see that the game state value increased from 0.05 to 0.11, which means that the interaction value, the value that Suarez and Messi created together is 0.107. So we did it for all interactions of these players. So we don't look at one interaction, we look at all interactions in a season. We sum the values of these interactions, and then we normalize for the minutes that they play together to make like an equal comparison. And then we have the offensive chemistry. So I explained offensive chemistry. So how did we do the defensive chemistry? For this, I have an example of the famous Italian duo Bonucci and Chiellini. So here you see there that Chiellini is in the duel, and then Bonucci is the one who recovers the possession. So what we want to measure is how do these players impact the opponent to not score goals. So for example, when we look at Chiellini and Bonucci, they're playing in the Serie A. For example, they play against AC Milan with Ibrahimovic. Before the game starts, we have like an expected impact. So we predict what will be the impact of Ibrahimovic. So that's based on his previous performances. Then we have an actual impact. So we observe what actually happened. These impact values come from the VAPE, the EPV framework. And then we look at the difference between those two values, and then we have like the credit that we assign to Bonucci and Chiellini. But we don't only do this for one match, we do this for all matches in the season. So for example, when they play against Inter with Lukaku, and against Teco, AS Roma, and we see all the credits, we can take the average of those credits, and then we have the defensive chemistry of Chiellini and Bonucci. So this actually means that Chiellini and Bonucci together make their opponents play like 0.13 lower impact than expected. So that brings me back to this slide. So I've shown you how we can do this for offensive and for defensive chemistry. And I showed a lot of examples of like high profile players, but we didn't only do this for like the Premier League and stuff, but we also did it for women's leagues and also for like youth championships, so the under 21. And all these results can be found on our GitHub page, so check it out. So you can find over 350 seasons and then the top 5 pairs in terms of offensive and defensive chemistry. And it goes back until 2015, 2016. So that's cool. That's nice that we can measure this chemistry, but what we actually want to do as well is like predict for unseen pairs. So if we have 2 players, so for example, the Liverpool case, we haven't seen Carroll play at Liverpool before, so we want to predict beforehand what would happen if he would go there. So as an example, we look at Messi and Suarez. We've seen, like in our results, they're like every season they're one of the best in the La Liga, in the Spanish league. But currently Suarez is injured, so well, Barcelona might be looking for a replacement for him. As they want someone who's like who gels well with Messi. So what we did, we trained the machine learning model using all observations. So if over 97,000 observations of player pairs and their chemistries, we present all player pairs with a mathematical representation, and then we with a lot of characteristics, and then the model learns what's important for chemistry. So for example, the Messi and Suarez, we have a lot of information, their age, position line, but also things about their culture, so the language that they speak, where were they born, which region of the world where are they from, and also their player role, so mobile striker, shadow striker. And we combine these two vectors of the players to like a player pair feature representation, where we combine stuff like this, do they speak the same language, are they from the same country, are they from the same region, and also how many matches did they play together before. And then we have the observed chemistry, so that's a label that we try to predict for unseen pairs. So we do this all these observations. For example, Kane and Moura at Tottenham are currently the worst player pair in the Premier League. We open those labels in the machine learning model, and it learns like what are like important features for chemistry. So if we go back to the example of Messi Suarez, we identified 3 possible replacements for Suarez, so Alexis Sanchez, Tara Martinez, and Roberto Firmino. We fill in these feature representations, so we create these mathematical representations for all of these player pairs. So we know, for example, that Sanchez speaks the same language, they both speak Spanish, but they're not from the same country. But they did play together a lot before, because Sanchez already played at Barcelona for a long time ago, 180 matches. We do the same for Lautaro Martinez. He's from Argentina, so same language, same country as Messi, and they played 4 matches for the Argentina national team together. And the third example, Roberto Firmino never played together with Messi before, but he's from the same region of the world. He's also from South America. So we use our player pair chemistry predictor, so the machine learning model we trained on these 97,000 examples, and then we get a predicted chemistry for each of those player pairs. So if we go to this example, we see that Lautaro Martinez is the player with the highest predicted chemistry with Lionel Messi. That's mainly because of his playing style, but also because he already played some matches together with Messi before, and he's from Argentina as well. And if you look at Firmino, he's currently the one with the lowest predicted chemistry. But the interesting thing that we saw in our model is that the more matches players tend to play together, the higher their chemistry. So their chemistry increases after a while. So what we did here is we simulated. So these 3 players, let them play matches with Messi, more and more and more. And then we can see what happens if they play more matches together. And the interesting thing here is that we see that after around 20 matches, Firmino gets higher chemistry with Messi than Sanchez has, because Sanchez already played a lot of matches together with Messi before, so it won't increase anymore. So I think an interesting insight, and this might help Barcelona to find a good replacement. So to go back to the questions, the last one from a player's perspective. So we showed how we can use this for a club, but as a player you also want to go to a club that fits you well. And as an example, I took an American player, so new talent, Serginho Dest, playing at Ajax, and he's been linked to move to Bayern Munich. So what we did, we identified five clubs that are looking for a right back, that's been linked to right backs: Arsenal, Chelsea, Bayern Munich, Tottenham, and Borussia Dortmund. And for these clubs, we used our team builder. So our team builder is an LP problem optimizer, and optimizes the mutual chemistry among players. So we take all players from Bayern Munich, the complete squad, we add Dest to the squad, we put it into our team builder, and it gives us an optimal lineup. So what this team builder does, we tell the team builder, you should select Dest, you should select in total 4 defenders, 3 midfielders, 3 attackers, and 1 goalkeeper, and then you should optimize the mutual chemistries among all players. We did this for all the 5 clubs, so they're shown there. We got all 5 optimal lineups, but the thing is interested from Dest's perspective, so we don't want the optimal lineup from the team's perspective, but we're interested from Dest, what is his chemistry with the other players in this lineup? So that's what we're looking at here. So we looked at all lines from his side, and then we found that Bayern Munich is the one with the highest chemistry from his perspective. And the greener the lines here, the higher the chemistry that we predicted. And it's very high chemistry with Gnabry, the right winger, who tends to go inwards, and Dest can then, he's like an attacking wing back, he can go up. So to conclude, I showed you how our framework measures the and predicts both defensive and offensive chemistry between any pair of players. We also showed how we can use this to find a new player for a team. So in this example, we used Barcelona, and we found that Martinez is a good replacement for Suarez. And we also showed how we can use it like from the other way around, from a player's perspective, to find the best club for him, which was for Dest Bayern Munich. Thanks for your attention, and don't forget to check out the GitHub with all the results. Thanks.
I'll just jump in again. That was great. Super interesting. Can you say a few words about what are the variables that go into defining the state of the game? So is it the position of the ball, or specific, or is it? Yeah. That's a lot, but it's mainly about the position of the ball, also how the ball progressed to this position. So we're using event data here, so we don't know all the positions of all players. But we do know how the ball progressed there, also what body type is used, what kind of action it is, so pass, a dribble, cross, that kind of stuff goes in there. Yeah. So so there's like the history there. Like there's some time window of history that you take into account?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How the ball progressed there, what the speed of the game is as well. So like in a counter attack in soccer, it's pretty important that that's a big difference with a low speed attack. Yeah.
And then when you look at the projecting forward, then to figure out the probability of the goal, you must project forward until something happens, like until.
Yeah. So what we do is the label is like whether within 10 actions there's a goal being scored. That's a label in the setting. Yeah. And we tried it like for increasing or decreasing this, but it didn't really. Well, at some point it doesn't change anymore. So yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I always find tricky about soccer is that a goal is such a rare event, right?
Yeah.
So doing this in basketball is much easier because you score every 24 seconds, right? So do you have some idea of how much data you need in order to get a good estimate on sort of the likelihood of a state resulting in a goal, just because you know, one goal can make a big difference because it's such a rare event?
Yeah, indeed. So that's also the reason why we, in the end, built this framework to rate these game states. Because in soccer, if you only look at goals, it's very rare. So in this model, there's like millions of game states in there to train it. So we trained this on all the previous seasons that we have data from. So that's I think goes to 100 million game states that's in there. Yeah.
Very nice work.
Thanks.
So my question is really, the first one at least is a technical one. So in the parameterization of the model, you have both these interaction effects that you talked about, which are capturing like same language, same country, number of matches played together. But then you also have individual player effects, right? And so my question for you, when you're sort of saying you're finding a player that's the best chemistry, how much of the variability across players is induced by the chemistry, those couple interactions, and how much of it is introduced by player skill?
Yeah, so skill is not in the thing. It's like more about how they play, so more like playing style. That's like pretty important feature in the model that we saw. Yeah, so it's more like the player styles together that are like bringing chemistry to the team. Yeah,
and it's those discrete playing styles.
Yeah.
Cool. I guess a follow-up on that is there any way to further account for a formation a team plays?
Yeah, that's the thing we're also thinking about. I think that's something we need to look into. So I think it's about player roles. So formations is like something that's currently quite. I think it will change in the future. So it's like 4-4-2, 4-3-3 is like the one 4-3-3 is like not the same as the other 4-3-3. So I think that in the end we need to go to in soccer analytics we need to go to something else than just those numbers, but more like playing style, player roles, more like tactics to get to this to account for that as well. Yeah. So we do account for the player roles, so like an offensive wingback or like more defensive wingback, but we don't account for the formation yet. No.
That turned everything into FIFA. Like the last looked like FIFA Ultimate Team, so I really appreciated that. So my question is that as we saw, familiarity and the number of matches that you play together boosts chemistry, and we saw that. Is it also true using the Tottenham example? I'm an Arsenal supporter, so using the Tottenham example, is it the Tottenham example, the Harry Kane example? At what point do you know when it's not working between two players?
Oh, that's a good thing. Yeah, so I think then the Tottenham example at Kane and Moura, we saw that like it's more like playing style. So they're like both central strikers, but Kane is like more like a poacher who wants to score, and Moura is like running all around. And apparently that doesn't work. I think we could look at like examples of players that we see that they play a lot together and see whether that works out or not. But in the prediction, we see that playing more together increases this chemistry, but it also depends on the playing styles of the players. So we saw for Firmino that it increases, but that's also because his playing style fits Messi's style pretty well. So we've seen in the past that these types of players work well together, and that's why it increases. But for players that don't work well together, it won't increase that much.
And related to that, is there have you found that your model could be used to find sort of players who are typecast incorrectly, who should be playing a different position but are not?
Yeah, that's some like an interesting use case that we didn't look into yet, but I think that's really nice to show that. So we also showed it at some clubs, and they were like, okay, but if you put this player in this position, would that change the model? And well, that's something we might want to look into in the future.
Great,
yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, we have time for a couple of questions from the audience as well.
Can I do one quick one for you?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
Okay. This, I promise this will be fast. When you define the state of the games, you have a list of variables, and when you define the players, you have a list of features. Did you do some kind of a sensitivity analysis to figure out if your model is more sensitive to some of those variables or some of the features that you use to define the players?
So you mean in the prediction of the chemistry between players, right? Yeah, so we did this, we looked at like the robustness of the model, so changing stuff and then looking at whether it's like over seasons, whether it's the same predictions. So that's what we looked into. We also, you have the things from player 1, things from player 2. And that we were thinking like maybe that influences because like the alignment is not correct if you have, kind of random that you select the same kind of players always as player 1. Yeah. So we switch it around and we use like every example twice, the other way around, and also to make it like more robust, the model. Yeah.
Let me ask it a slightly different way. Which of the features is the most important in making the distinctions? Yeah.
It's a combination of the player roles, actually, of the two players. That's what we see that's most important in most cases. So beforehand, I actually thought like language would play a big role. That was my first impression, but it actually doesn't really play a big role. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Do you have any questions from the audience?
Hi. So soccer, you have 3 subs. Let's just say you bring in a player who activates 4 other players, but now that player gets injured. So how sensitive is this model to situations like that, where one player changes the entire dynamic?
Yeah, well, that could happen. So I think now our team builder is focused on like the lineups, the optimal lineups. In the end, we want to go to optimal squads. So to go to like optimal 23 players that you select for your season, that you can handle any injury. You can like simulate injuries. What happens? Something else like red cards. So that's something we want to go to, that's like the next step. So now it's focused on the first 11, but I think in the end you need to have like the best 23 to be able to capture all things that happen during a season. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible that like passing from Messi to Suarez is more effective than Suarez to Messi? And how would you take that into account, like using a directed graph on your chemistry thing?
Yeah.
Or image?
A good thing. So in the interactions, we take into account like the passes from Messi to Suarez and also the other way around. But in our EPV framework, so the VAPE framework, we don't take into account who receives the ball. That would be like it would be cool to have, but it's like really hard to train. Like for Messi, we have quite some data but also for like new players, you want to know how they play. But I think I agree that maybe it's always best to pass the ball to Messi, and that's the best game state. I think it is, but yeah. But that's an exception, of course, Messi, I think.
All right. If there aren't any other questions, please give it up for Lotte. And next up, we have Luke Gerstner, who will talk about how to measure the impact of robotic umpires in baseball. Please give it up for Luke.
Hi, everyone. Are we good to start?
You're good to start.
Good? Okay, great. Thank you guys. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you to our judges for being here today. Thank you guys so much for that. We'll just get right into it. So I'm presenting on the behalf of myself, John Palomini, and James Zahn. It was a great work we did here with measuring the impact of robotic umpires in Major League Baseball. So to start, just a brief overview. So we're going to go through the inspiration, why we want to do this work, talk about our data set, go through the methods, how we did, what we did, our results, and then talk about discussion, so what this work actually means and how it's going to impact the game, and then talk a little bit about the future work, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions from you guys. So to start with inspiration, I'm going to share a video with you guys. On your guys' left will be a strike zone. On the right is a video from an at-bat between Marco Estrada and Manny Machado from 2015. Notice how the umpire is not very good in this at-bat. So here's the first pitch. So that one's a ball, and the umpire gets it correct. That's the only one he gets correct this at-bat. So it should have been a ball. Was it called strike? It was a little too high. That one should have been a strike. It was called a ball. Again, should have been strike, called a ball. And here Machado thinks he earned a walk, but he calls it a strike. It was actually a ball. And then finally Machado gets a walk on a pitch that was a strike. So this, out of our data set, was one of the worst at-bats. There was a foul ball included in there, but we filtered that out in our data and focused only on umpire-pitcher interaction. So this is one example of, the impact just regular umpires are having on the game. Ultimately Machado earned the walk that he probably should have gotten, or maybe shouldn't have gotten, because half of the pitches were strikes, half of them were balls. So that's just a great example of kind of where we're at with the state of umpiring right now. So some further inspiration, robotic umpire usage has kind of started to happen. It happened last summer in the Atlantic League, a very low level of professional baseball where they kind of test out new ideas that they might want to bring to the professional, like MLB level. And it's also been done in the background a little bit in spring training this year. And so we wanted to know how umpires are currently performing and really how much their performance is impacting the game. So like what we just saw in the video there. And then knowing how this potential change will impact the game is important across all levels. So for teams, for the league, with different rules they would have with this. And then also it's very important for players to understand, as we'll see later on, with how this could affect some pitchers specifically. So just to go quickly through our data acquisition and some description of it. So we collected data from Keuchel, a great source for any public data set. So it has every pitch from 2015 to 2018 MLB season. So it's over 2.8 million pitches, and there's about 40 features on the pitches, and there's a lot more features on other stuff. Like there's data in here that looks at like the ejections during games. So it has all the data you could possibly want. But as I said before, we focused only on the pitcher-umpire interaction. So only when an umpire calls the pitch a ball or calls the pitch a strike. If it's a ball that's put into play or a foul ball, anything like that, that's filtered out for our analysis. And we also used a universal strike zone to determine missed calls. So for every single pitch that the umpire called, we determined was that pitch actually a ball or actually a strike, sort of how we showed in that video where we labeled every pitch of that at-bat. Just some brief data description here. So on our left we show the frequency of all the different pitch codes that are in the data. So they have it broken down into balls, called balls, and balls in the dirt. So it's just interesting that for some reason they tagged balls and balls in the dirt separately. And as you see, there's a lot more called balls than called strikes. And then also on the right shows you how well umpires are doing. So over the past 4 years, they're roughly around 90% correct and remain at like 10% incorrect. So it's not huge fluctuation in their performance over the years, but they are still missing 10% of pitches overall. And then here is a graph that shows you how much they're missing of each pitch type. So the most inaccurate pitch type is a knuckleball, which makes sense. It moves a lot. It's hard for umpires to really gauge where it crossed the zone. And then the next 4 pitches that are seen in like the next 4 darkest bars there are all kind of fastball pitch variants. So it's sinkers, 4 seams, 2 seams, and cutters. So they're harder pitches, but you would think maybe these would be easier to call balls and strikes. But if you think about it, often pitchers are throwing these more on the corners or trying to locate them very well, not trying to throw them right down the middle of the plate. It's a little bit harder for the umpire to call as a correctly ball or strike. And then here is just a heat map on our left. Oh, that looks terrible for you guys. Well, I promise you that is a heat map. If you want to see what it actually looks like, visit our poster. It's on there. I'm not sure it's correct down here, but I'll skip that. Basically, the point of that is the edges of the strike zone. Umpires aren't good at calling balls and strikes correctly, as you would imagine. Right down the middle. Oh, here we go. So yeah, right down the middle, very accurate. Outside the strike zone, pretty accurate, but those corners of the strike zone, very inaccurate. And then just interesting note on the right here is that there's a metric called the nasty factor, which just determines how nasty a pitch is based on velocity, movement, location. And so as the nasty factor increases, it gets harder for umpires to call the pitch correctly, as you could imagine. But it's good to see that that is true in our data. So we're going to go to our methods here. So we needed to find a metric that can determine how much impact this is actually having on the game, these incorrect calls or correct calls. So we used RE24. And so basically this is an existing metric that we turned into RE12. So RE24 is a run expectancy measure for each out and base state. For example, 0 outs, nobody on, that's a 0.461 run expectancy. And to calculate the RE24 of an at-bat, you take the run expectancy of the end state. So say that's a runner on second and first, no out, minus the run expectancy of the beginning state, plus the amount of runs scored in that at-bat. So we use this metric, and for every count, we took all the at-bats that ended in that count and determined the RE24 of that at-bat, and averaged all of that together to get our results, which show that for an 0-2 count, 1-2 count, and 2-2, there's all negative run expectancies. So in here, we would imagine there's an advantage to the pitcher, not to the batter. The rest of the counts, interestingly enough, positive run expectancy. Even an 0-1 count has a positive run expectancy on average. So you can see how much changing the count can really impact an at-bat. You see, like from an 0-1 is 0.03, but a 1-0 is almost double of that, of 0.057. So quite a large difference there. And overall, on average, if 15 calls are missed in the favor of one team, so one batting team, over the course of a game, that's going to lead to an additional expected runs scored, because it's about, on average, 0.065 per run. So 15 of those over the course of a game, you're going to be expected to score one more run. And with a lot of games decided by 1 run or less, this is a huge deal for the game of baseball. One thing to note, though, is that there's a huge difference in the distribution of missed calls. So we have a lot more pitches that were inaccurately called as balls. So it's a strike, but it was called as a ball. And then there was as miscalled strikes. So a pitch that was a ball that the umpire called as a strike. So we see that for miscalled balls, the average run expectancy is plus 0.12. For the miscalled strikes, it's negative 0.1. So if these distributions on the graph on the right were roughly equal, there would be almost no impact on an umpire missing a call because they're missing it both ways equally. But we see that there are a lot more times where umpires are calling a pitch a ball when it should have actually been a strike. And that's why it's actually helping the batting teams by increasing the run expectancy. And then we want to look at just some results on basis of pitchers. So here, the gray bar represents the league average of percent of calls pitchers are getting in their favor. So league average for each year varies a little bit, but say it's about 3% for each year. And then the blue bar here represents Gerrit Cole, and the orange is Justin Verlander. So these pitchers each year have about roughly league average in percent of the calls that they're getting in their favor. So this is an example of pitchers that are at the top of the game that aren't really relying on missed calls from umpires. They're still performing at a very, very high level, and they're not getting much higher percent calls in their favor. We see something very different with a couple other pitchers, Masahiro Tanaka and Clayton Kershaw. So with these guys, especially in the past more recent years, Kershaw in red, you see he's almost twice that of league average. So he's getting almost double the amount of calls in his favor than the rest of the league is. So this is a really big deal, and maybe this is because Kershaw is known to be one of the top pitchers in the game. Maybe it's some reputation or some respect he's earned around the game that umpires, think, oh yeah, it's Kershaw, that pitch is a strike. Maybe it's because, as I showed earlier, his pitches are really nasty, and so it's hard to accurately call them. So there's definitely a couple different reasons, but if robotic umpires were put into place, they would not be getting this great benefit that they're getting currently. And then we're going to look at two specific examples. So first, Dallas Keuchel. So in 2015 and 2017, he's in the blue bar here. 2015, he was a Cy Young winner. He was an All-Star. 2017, he was an All-Star. You see he's getting a great amount more than league average of calls in his favor. We're not saying this is definitely why he was successful, but it must play some sort of impact in his success in those years. And you notice his other years, he was much lower, and he was not an all-star, not close to Cy Young, anything like that. And then we'll look at Felix Hernandez in 2015. All the rest of the years, he's at or below league average. 2015, he was Cy Young, finished 7th. He was an all-star. This is also his most recent best year. So it's kind of interesting that we're seeing, pitchers when they're getting a lot more calls in their favor. For some, we have no impact, such as like Gerrit Cole, Justin Verlander. For others, Tanaka, Kershaw, they're getting a lot more in their favor. And then here, some examples of pitchers that are, maybe their success is dependent a little bit on this fact that they're getting calls in their favor. And then we just want to talk about the discussion. And impact on players. So this morning, I think Bill James, in that talk, they mentioned something about pitch framing and how important that's becoming in baseball. That would no longer be important because it would not matter how a catcher presents the ball to the umpire. It would just simply be where did that pitch cross the zone, and that's that. That's determined automatically. So catcher's value decreases a lot. Hitters getting missed calls will become, hitters that are getting more missed calls will become less valuable, as imagined, so they're going to need to adjust their game some. So an example of this is a batter like Joey Votto. He's kind of known around the league to have a really great eye and a command of the strike zone. Maybe this is true, or maybe it's based on reputation, as we saw with some of the pitchers. So hitters are going to need to change their game too, and going to need to learn what exactly is a strike, because the umpire's not going to ever give them the benefit of the doubt. And pitchers, so pitchers that rely less on missed calls, such as I said, Cole and Verlander, they're going to be even more valuable than they are now, because they're elite at what they're doing currently. And if they go to robotic umpires, they really won't be impacted that much. And so their value is going to remain incredibly high. So that's a very interesting thing. But the reverse might happen with a pitcher like Dallas Keuchel, that his great years have been more related to when he's getting more calls in his favor. And then finally, we want to share some ideas for future work. We heard a lot of great ideas yesterday when we presented as well, and from people coming to our poster. So one thing we need to do is have a dynamic strike zone. So right now it's static. For every batter, it's the same strike zone. Obviously, that's not true. So this is when we're determining if an umpire had called the pitch correctly or not. So adjusting it based on player's height. We need to get data of players' heights and include that. And then also just inspecting more the impact on batters, as I talked about before. And then also how are pitchers going to adapt to different umpires' strike zones. So we can look at that now because, different umpires have different strike zones. But then when a robotic umpire comes along, that's going to also be different than what they're completely used to now, just based on the definition of what a strike is. I'd like to thank you guys. Thank you to the judges, and thank you to the audience. You guys were great yesterday, and thank you again for coming today. Oh, any questions?
Great, thanks. So I have a lot of questions, but I will keep it brief. I think part of this analysis focuses on the margin in terms of the data that you were able to get from Keuchel. Mm-hmm. Did you do any sort of ground truth or testing of the data to make sure that the edges were called as accurately as this relies upon?
So I think that's kind of represented in the video we showed. That was the actual data and the actual location of how we were determining if it was a strike or a ball. So that was like one case where we checked data, but it's coming from, I forget exactly what the data comes from, like where they're getting location of pitches, but it's not something that was like manually annotated, if that makes you more confident in kind of location stuff, yeah. Yeah,
and then along those lines, I think one of the most important aspects of an umpire's reputation and skill is consistency.
For sure.
As opposed to accuracy in a lot of ways. So I would imagine that this analysis would be probably most useful on a per umpire basis. Did you look at that at all?
We didn't, but that's a great point because we also read some other work that even there is great difference between umpires, especially the older generation compared to the younger generation. The younger generation of umpires are much more consistent and much more accurate, where the older umpires are maybe not as good at either of those metrics. So, yeah, that's a great thing to look at. Just split it on umpire and see when Tanaka has this umpire behind the plate, how much is it impacting him versus when he has this other umpire, or even section it off into like clusters of umpires. You could do some cluster modeling to come up with like 3 or 4 different groups of umpires and look at it that way as well. So yeah, thank you. That's a great point.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
I have a quick question, and that's really to do with the strike zone. I'm curious, you sort of, with the exception of those fastballs, it seems to be that pitches with a lot of movement are more likely to be misclassified. And so the question is, if robo umpires sort of become a thing, should it be a 2D strike zone or a 3D strike zone?
I think you would need to have a 3D strike zone. They were talking about that this morning too. Bill James and everyone this morning was discussing robotic umpires and how it would need to be a 3D strike zone. Because you need to look at not just where it crosses the plate, but kind of the back end of the plate too. Like where is it breaking for, curveballs, sliders, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think it would definitely need to be a 3D strike zone. In our analysis, the data that we had was only a 2D location of pitches. We didn't have that third dimension, unfortunately.
Cool. Very nice. So a couple questions. So when you made your chart about the change in the run expectancy as a function of the count, of the current count, let me just make sure I understand what you did. So you took the innings with errors and calculated the sort of the run expectancy, and then the innings without errors that had the same count, and then compared the difference. Is that you made that chart?
No. So what we did was we took every at-bat that ended in I'll just do one example, 0-0 count.
Yeah.
So every at-bat that ended there.
Yeah.
So, first pitch, they put it in play. And we calculate for every at-bat that the metric I shared earlier, the RE24, based on the start state and end state.
Yeah.
And so we took all those, and then we averaged them all together to determine what is the RE12 of a 0-0 count. So before you have an RE24 based on how many base runners, how many outs. But now we're looking at it on an per count level. And so that's why we see, different metrics there and some different results where some counts are now definitely pitchers counts, and some are definitely more towards the hitter's side of things.
And do you think that difference between some counts favoring the pitcher and some favoring the batter, is that because the umpires are making different mistakes based on what the count is, or do you think that is the natural statistical variation that would arise just because there's some asymmetry in the balls versus strikes?
Yeah, I think it's definitely some just like natural thing that happens over the course of an at-bat. You know, like there are definitely times when a pitcher has an advantage. I personally would think an 0-1 count, pitcher definitely has the advantage. But according to this, the hitter actually has the advantage. So it's something very interesting that you wouldn't necessarily expect. But a big emphasis has been, a pitcher getting the first 2 of 3 pitches to be strikes. So we see that, when they're up 1-2 or 0-2, that's just significantly better than, if it's 1-1 or 2-1 or something like that. Yeah.
I see. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit now. Sure. So if I'm trying to predict sort of the outcome of the game, how much, like the number of runs, the change in the number of runs, as soon as an error happens, you have changed the state of the game. So your analysis, I think, will tell you instantaneously what happens at that at bat. Mm-hmm. But do you have thoughts on how fair it is to or how much you have to take into account projecting forward based on the fact that the state of the game has changed?
Right. Yeah, that's definitely a big thing. If an umpire misses a call in the first inning, that's a little bit different when he misses a call in the 5th. So it definitely changes that for sure. Our analysis does not include that. Ours is kind of more of a static analysis in that it's taking it just at the granular level in that bat, not considering all the other factors, which is a great point. And I think there's also, somebody brought up the point yesterday of like makeup calls. If I'm hitting in the first inning, the umpire calls it a strike when it was a ball. Maybe when I come up again in the 4th, 5th inning, he's going to give me a call back. So that's also an interesting point. It's like, how does that change over the course of a game? Are umpires actually giving makeup calls, or are they trying to stay consistent throughout, which is, affects the state of the game just so greatly. It's really interesting. If robotic umpires were to come into play, like they eliminates all of that. So it's a very interesting thing.
Do you have I'm going to allow you to speculate if you want. Do you want to speculate on how you might include that if you were going to take the analysis, sort of do the next step on the projecting forward?
I think we would just have to look at kind of like, okay, so this is the state now. This is the state that it would be if they called it accurately, and this is the state that it actually is. So just looking at that comparison of kind of like, we know what did happen, but looking at, what could have happened if this change had happened, and look at it that way as well. Yeah. It's good that we have at least some sort of ground truth. Maybe it might not actually be the truth. It's some sort of baseline that we can compare to. Yeah.
And one more quick one. So I know MLB is not just interested in expected runs, but also number of strikeouts, number of walks, number of home runs. Did you guys do an analysis on that as well?
No, we didn't, because we wanted to look at, for right now to start, we wanted to look at kind of a broader spectrum of just how much, because this is a really hot topic, so we want to think like, what's the biggest impact it would have, and that's probably on the totality of the game and maybe how pitchers are evaluated. So that's what we went with, but I think that's great to look at in the future as well. Individually, like our pitchers are going to be expected to have 20 more strikeouts, or some pitchers expected to have even less now because, Kershaw's not getting that breaking ball. That's actually a ball called as a strike, stuff like that. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask one as it goes by. So I'm wondering if we're removing this source of randomness from games, if better players are going to become more valuable because you have like less randomness essentially affecting their value.
Yeah, I think it's really hard right now because for some players that randomness might really help them, as we saw, with Dallas Keuchel, Felix Hernandez, or even Kershaw. He's just always getting more calls than the league average. And then for some, so I think you would start to see, more separation of the elite pitchers compared to the ones that are very good right now, but would maybe take a little bit of a step back. And I think, you see that also as players age. They start to become more of, they say, now I'm more of a pitcher when I used to be more of a thrower. And, they're starting to try to locate better, change speeds a lot more, and that would also, change a lot with robotic umpires too. Yeah.
Do you have a feel on how pitchers will sort of the game theoretic element of how they will adjust either their pitch distribution or the pitches they're throwing?
Yeah, I think pitchers would need to look at basically, okay, here I have all this past data on myself. Let's look at, okay, what pitches am I actually throwing for true strikes? What pitches am I relying a little bit more help on the umpire with? And so for every pitcher that might be different. Somebody might have a two-seam fastball that moves like crazy, and umpires are giving them that call a lot more often than, their changeup that, umpires call accurately more often. So I think that part would really change on a pitcher-to-pitcher level more than on an aggregate level, for sure.
I have one really quick question about makeup calls. So as part of your analysis, you found that there were far more strikes that were called balls than were called strikes.
Sure, yeah.
Did you look at what point in the at-bat or in the game those were called and whether or not, excuse me, that was just an umpire maybe naturally biased against calling strikeouts?
No, we didn't, but I think that, you should look at, is it like an 0-2 count and an umpire is just like, no, I won't call that pitch because it's an 0-2 count. Is there some sort of bias that underlies these things? I think that's definitely a possibility, and more than likely it is something that happens. I would think in my time of watching baseball, I feel like I've seen a great amount of great 0-2 pitches that they're just like, almost call it strike three, but then kind of like, no, that was a ball. So yeah, I think that's definitely could be a factor in umpires making the call. So yeah, it's just very interesting overall, like robotic umpires come into play, all this is gone, and it's just what is true. There's no sort of bias. Not that I'm saying I support or don't support robotic umpires. I'll leave that up to you guys to decide.
All right. Thank you very much. Give it up for Luke, please.
Thank you.
And next up, we have Jonathan Bosch, who will talk about NBA lineup analysis. Please give it up for Jonathan.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Bosch. I'm an undergraduate student at Syracuse University. My co-author, Sam Kalman, is an undergraduate student at Purdue. And our title of our paper is called NBA Lineup Analysis on Clustered Player Tendencies. So first of all, if none of you guys know, the traditional positions of basketball are the point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, and center. If you want to know what position LeBron James plays, you look it up. Basketball Reference tells you that LeBron James is a power forward, a small forward, and a shooting guard. And prior to the NBA season, the Lakers announced that they plan to start LeBron James at point guard this season. On my fantasy basketball team, I have the ability to start Tobias Harris at power forward and small forward. My reason for bringing this up is that the positions of basketball no longer describe what a player brings to the court and what role they possess. So what Sam and I want to do is create a framework to create new positions that will better define what a player's role and responsibilities are on the basketball court. So first, we want to use clustering to do this, and what clustering is it groups data based on similar characteristics, and the characteristics that we want to use are player stats. So we collected the last 10 seasons of NBA player stats from basketballreference.com, and we aggregated by season. So this is the distribution of all the games played, and as you can see, there's a node at 5 games and at 25 games. So we decided to make a 30-game criteria where we filtered out anyone who didn't play more than 30 games in the season. They did not receive a cluster because we felt that we would not have enough information to give them a proper role. So next, we selected all of our variables to use for our clustering. These are the 23 variables we chose. We believe that these 23 variables do an excellent job at accounting for a player's opportunities, skills, and tendencies when on the basketball court. So the clustering method we wanted to use is model-based clustering. Model-based clustering uses an expectation maximization algorithm to fit Gaussian finite mixed models to our 23 variables. It uses a Bayesian information criteria, which ends up selecting 9 clusters as the ideal amount of clusters for for our players. What the benefits of model-based clustering are is it assigns a soft probability to all of our players, meaning instead of just saying that a certain player is within one cluster, it receives a probability of membership in all 9 of the clusters. So for example, player could have a 80% chance of being in cluster 1 and a 20% chance of being in cluster 2 and 0 for all the other clusters. We utilize this in R using the mclust package. So fitting a Gaussian mixture model, the algorithm here finds the maximum likelihood estimate of the below likelihood equation and uses that BIC to find the optimal distribution of the unlabeled data. It uses the parameters mu sub k is the mean of the distribution and sigma squared sub k is the variation. And below is a graphical representation that shows the parameters and the distributions. So for our cluster breakdown, we had all the probabilities for each player, right? And for whatever was their highest probability, we assigned that player into that cluster. So these are the counts through clusters 1 through 9 of all the players that we had. We had 3,600 players in our database. The cluster themselves, 1 through 9, has no meaning whatsoever. It's just different groups. So what we need to do is analyze each cluster to give these clusters meanings. So this is how we did this. This is cluster number 3 that we named it the 3-point shooting guard. The 3-point shooting guard shot mostly threes, and they were catch and shoot threes, and they had a high conversion rate. And we see this in the graph because they had a high 3-point attempt rate, they had a high 3-point assist rate, and they shot the 3 at a high percentage. So some of their low stats that we looked at was that when they did not shoot the ball at all from 0 and 3 feet away from the basket. And their turnover rate was also low, which suggests they had they did not have the ball in their hands enough to turn the ball over. They're an off-ball player. They also had a very low offensive rebounding rate, which suggests that they operate not inside the paint, they operate on the three-point line. For each of our clusters, we had our core example players, which were players that were within these clusters with 99% probability. So 2 core example players for the 3-point shooting guard was Klay Thompson and JJ Redick, and they really fit this cluster well. So this is a comprehensive list of the other 8 clusters, and then including 3-point shooting guards. So we have the high usage guard, the stretch forward, the 3-point shooting guard, the traditional center, versatile role player, floor general, mid-range big, skilled forward, and the ball dominant scorer. We highlight 2 of the traits that they were high in and 2 of the traits that they were low in, but these were not the only 4 things that we looked at when naming these clusters. We also highlight 2 core example players for each of the 9 clusters. So because we collected the data aggregated on season, we were able to see how a certain player's cluster changed from year to year, or if it stayed consistent from year to year. So some of the ones we want to point out is that Klay Thompson throughout his entire career has always been a 3-point shooting guard for the Warriors, and that makes sense to us because his role has always been the same, playing off ball with Steph and not dribbling much at all, just catch and shoot. LeBron James has always been a ball dominant scorer no matter what team he's been on, no matter what players he's played with. That has been his role for his team. 2 interesting changes that we saw was Kawhi Leonard started his career with the Spurs, playing under Tony Parker and Tim Duncan, and he was a stretch forward at the time. But now that Kawhi has developed into one of the higher used players in the NBA and a star player, he has transformed into a ball dominant scorer the last couple of years. Brook Lopez is known for developing a 3-point shot lately in the past few seasons. So he changed from a mid-range big to a skilled forward, and we were very pleased to see this because 3-point shooting is far more apparent in skilled forwards than it is in mid-range bigs. So our model still experiences our initial problem where not every player can't be completely defined by one cluster or one position. However, with the probabilities, 87% of our players in our data frame, they had their highest probability was over 90. So that was very good to see, but there were some players like Dirk Nowitzki and Matt Barnes that were split halfway between 2 clusters. So next we want to do a lineup analysis using these clusters to see if there's an ideal combination of these players. So first we collected 5-man lineup data from NBAstats.com. We ended up having to eliminate all the lineups that contained players in which we didn't have clusters for. If you remember, we had a 30-game requirement for you to receive a cluster, so any person that was in a lineup that had not played 30 games throughout the season, we had to eliminate all those lineups. We ended up having 14,000 lineups. We ended up creating these 9 predictor variables, and we called this the soft lineup variables. So we take all the probabilities of each of the 5 players on the floor, all of their cluster probabilities, and sum them up within each cluster. So this is a demonstration of an Oklahoma City Thunder lineup where we take all their probabilities and sum them up, and we have 5 predictor variables, and then the other 4 clusters that are missing here have values of 0. So for every row of our lineup data, the 9 clusters should all sum to 5 because there's 5 players on the court. Next, we wanted to create our response variable. We decided that net rating would fit this well. Net rating of the lineup is the lineup's scoring margin against the opponent per 100 possessions. The problem with this is with lineup data, this can be very noisy. If a lineup were to play 10 possessions and outscore their opponent 10-8 or 10-2, I'm sorry, their net rating would be 80, which is extremely unsustainable and unrealistic. So we decided to create this 600 possession threshold, which is 40 games of 15 possessions per game. And if a lineup exceeded this 600 possession threshold, we said, okay, their net rating is fine. We have enough of a sample of this lineup to believe this. If they did not, we had to weigh it towards a Bayesian prior, which we chose to be the team's net rating. So as a team, or as a lineup had closer and closer to 600 possession, there would be less and less weight on that team net rating and more weight on their own net rating. So this is a comparison of the Bayesian and the real net rating. As you can see, the creation of our Bayesian net rating eliminates those extreme unrealistic net rating values that were in the lineup data. So first we did a linear regression. We used the soft lineup predictor variables to estimate our Bayesian net rating. And so what this lineup would suggest is that the optimal lineup is playing 5 ball dominant scorers because they have the highest coefficient. You start 5 ball dominant scorers, and that's the best net rating you'll get. What this lineup, or what this model also suggests, is that if you keep adding ball dominant scorers to your lineup, then your net rating will go up. Well, you can only have 5 people on the court at the same time, so you can't do that without a substitution. So we realized that we're missing interactions in our model. So we want to incorporate interactions, and the way we're going to do this is with random forest modeling. So we bootstrapped 100 different random forest models, and what random forests are is like 500 decision trees, and they use bagging to resample the data, and at every resample, it creates a decision tree. So we bootstrapped 100 different random forest models, right? And then we created this all possible lineup data frame, and it had 3.1 million rows of all possible lineups with the precision of 0.25. So it kind of followed in this pattern. Any way you could distribute 0.25 probability of each cluster. So for all 3.1 million rows, we had 100 net rating predictions. So if we looked at the highest predicted net rating lineup, you can see it right there. We're going to call that lineup 1, and then the lowest predicted net rating lineup is lineup 3. If the main difference that we see here is between ball dominant scorer and high usage guard between the two lineups. The ball dominant scorer and high usage guard are both very high usage players, but the ball dominant scorer is far more efficient in their scoring and everything on offense. So we can see the significant drop off when they're replaced with a high usage guard. So it is very important that your high usage player in your lineup is an efficient player. Also, we can see that the 5 ball dominant scorer lineup is actually estimated less than what the linear regression estimated. So if we introduce another lineup here, lineup 2, that's taking the same lineup 1, which is our best lineup, and taking out the traditional center and a versatile role player and replacing it with guards. So we did this in a few different ways, replacing it with guards such as high usage guards, floor generals, and 3-point shooting guards. And what we found was that the net rating predictions were very, very similar. The green curve and the blue curve are almost identical. What that leads us to suggest is that small ball can be an effective way to play basketball. We took out the traditional centers, and you have an all-guard lineup, and the predicted net rating is still high. Here we show the effect of having stretch forward and ball dominant scores on the court. The blue color are low net rating predictions, and the red-orange colors are higher. As you can see, having the stretchability combined with your efficient, high-usage player is very important. And on the next slide, we have versatile role player and stretch forwards on the x-axis. Looking vertically, there's really not much difference. So the numbers of the vertical role players, the versatile role players on the floor do not really matter that much. But it's very apparent left from right that having that stretchability, having good shooters, and the ability to stretch the floor and make space for your other players is very important. So our modeling takeaways is that the ball dominant player must be effective. I highlighted that when comparing the lineups 1 and lineups 3. Versatile role players were consistently present in high-performing lineups, but also low-performing lineups. The traditional center may still hold value as people are going away from traditional center and they're looking for people or centers that are shooting threes and things. Our lineup 1 still had traditional center present in it. Also floor spacing, so the stretchability and the shooting ability paired with those efficient ball handlers and high usage players such as ball dominant scorers is very ideal. So our conclusion is that we created a framework to redefine the positions in basketball. We also modeled lineup efficiency with these new positions, and we saw how they interacted with each other. And we believe that this could be used by NBA front offices and coaching for in-game lineup decisions, free agency, and draft strategy. Lastly, I want to thank Carnegie Mellon University. Sam and I started this as a project during a summer undergraduate research experience, and we've expanded on it ever since, and now we're here. So we want to thank Rebecca Nugent, Max Horowitz, Ron Yurko, and Alden Green, and more. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'll start. That's very nice. So I guess my first question is, so you were looking at 10 years of data, is that from 2009? So if you had run the clustering algorithm just on 2009 data, and then you ran the clustering algorithm just on 2019 data, do you expect to see different clusters?
Probably, yeah. And probably a different, like, could be different amount of clusters too, right? It wouldn't be, like, it might not be 9 ideal clusters as well.
I mean, so did you actually take a look at that to see if you can see a signature in the way the game has changed since 2000?
No, we did not. But that would be very interesting to do, and I think that would be apparent now that we're shooting all these threes and everything.
So, okay, and then sort of a follow-up to that is, so now there are teams and other analysts who are also starting to include tracking data when you look at clustering. Do you think that tracking data gives you additional information that would change sort of the makeup of the clusters, or do you think you capture most of what you need in the box score data?
I think it would definitely change things, and I think especially like on the defensive side, player tracking data would help because most of our variables are offensive because we use public data and there's nothing really out there besides steals, which aren't the best indicator of defense. But also, like, something such as tracking data could pick up on speed and pace, and, like, I think it would categorize players like Russell Westbrook and Ben Simmons differently than, like, other players that they might be with now because of their pace and transition and everything, which is not captured by any of our variables.
And one more. So when you did the analysis at the end where you were swapping out the centers for the guards, presumably sometimes when you do those swaps, you are extrapolating to regions of sort of these lineups that have not been sampled by the data, right? 'Cause, I mean, there are some swaps you can make out where you could imagine you could interpolate pretty well because you have instances that are close to that, and some where you are where you're looking at a part of the space that teams just have not sampled. So, do you have any thoughts on sort of the reliability of that kind of extrapolation?
No, not necessarily, because the way that we created the random forest was using all of the lineup data that we had, and those predictions, so the lineup where we swap those out are like lineups that we created, right? So we did not check if like that specific lineup existed in the data frame.
Very nice. So this is sort of building on that last question. What sort of protections or how do we know for sure that this model hasn't overfit? Like, is it possible that optimal lineup you found is just like the Warriors in 2016?
It's not, because we checked. We looked at the Warriors lineup. But the BIC that we ended up choosing in not the clustering, sorry. I don't know. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So for the lineup model, the linear model, you essentially only have 5 coefficients. So it's very unlikely that's
right.
quote unquote overfitting. But the random forest or any sort of is this model so flexible that it's saying that these the optimal lineups are just like happen to be the 1 or 2 lineups of a very particular team with very particular players?
We didn't do any kind of testing on our forest model, but the fact that we went for distribution frames, so that's why we went for all the 100 different predictions on each lineup, so that way we could see if something, like if our highest predicted lineup was just like something crazy, but it had a wide variance between all the other predictions, and that would stand out like, oh, maybe that's not that reliable. Right. But when we had smaller prediction intervals, it would help with that.
That makes sense. Looking back at the clustering, the variables that you used in the clustering are actually like a blend of stylistic elements like 3-point
right.
attempt rate and rim attempt rate and so on, as well as skill elements, field goal percentage, even at PER, which is like an overall notion of skill. Mm. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on in having this like blend of both skill and style within the same clusters.
Because we want to see like, are these players, like what are they doing? What are they trying to do? What are their roles? And then how good are they at it? And I think that their 3-point attempt rate and their 3-point conversion rate can capture both of those. And we saw that like some of the 3-point shooting guard was good at all 3. Like they were taking a lot of threes, but they were also making a lot of threes. But there was other clusters where 3-point shooting was apparent, but then their 3-point percentage was not as high. So those are players that are still taking all their shots from 3, but they're just not nearly as lethal as the other ones.
Is it possible that some of those players like Barnes and so on who straddle multiple positions, they actually have the skills of one position, but they play stylistically like another one?
I think that's definitely possible. I think for Barnes, what we think is that we put height in our cluster, and that's something that's been in discussion with other people about whether that was a smart move or not. And I think that has to do with Barnes' split between 3-point shooting guard and stretch forward. So,
because skill is in these clusters, some of these clusters are probably picking up a lot more skillful players than others. So the ball dominant scorers, almost certainly if you looked at like the all-star roster, they're probably all ball dominant scorers, right?
Right.
So I'm wondering when the regression is saying we want lots of ball dominant scorers, if it's just saying we want a lot of skilled players.
Right. I mean, that's what it would suggest, because the ball dominant scorer is technically the star player, but fortunately we don't have those types of lineups like in our data frame, because no team has an all-star team, right?
Well, they shouldn't.
Yeah,
except the Warriors.
I thought that was great. I mean, my question is just the variability within the clusters. Like, if you have the optimal lineup, saying that you have ball dominant players, traditional centers, etc., how much does it matter who those players are? And have you tested that against the other combinations?
So it's definitely going to matter, and a future step of ours would be to tier each of the 9 clusters. So we would have like 27 clusters or something like that, because there definitely is variability of who are the better players in cluster 1 and who are the worst players. But I think that like right now the implementation is if you have 4 players on your roster, like you're starting, and you're trying to look for a 5th person to pair for them, you want to look for the type of player you're looking for, and then you go within that cluster and you find the better player in that cluster.
All right, thank you very much. Give it up for Jonathan, please.